Welcome to Real Crime Stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the rain as you dive into tonight's chilling tale. If you love true crime and horror, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Now, turn off the lights and let the story begin. I own a journal written by a serial killer. When I checked it this morning, I found a new entry. My first true crime novel was published in early 2011. The book followed the 4-year career of a serial killer in southern Illinois, covering the grisly details of his murders and eventually ending with his arrest. The book was absolutely perfect. I poured hundreds of hours into research, interviews, and writing. I was convinced that it was a sure ticket into a life as a famous author. My publisher had other plans. They claimed that money was far too tight and that they had to cancel my marketing campaign. It was just a coincidence that they abandoned me just as they pushed hundreds of thousands of dollars resources towards another author. So of course, my novel failed. Of course, no one bought it. And if there's one thing publishers avoid more than unpublished amateurs, it's authors with a single failed book. I've spent the last few years trying to cobble something together that might convince them to give me another chance. When I heard about a string of murders in my town, it seemed the perfect opportunity for a comeback. I poured myself another glass of whiskey by the light of my computer monitor. My ice cube had melted 3 glasses back. But no matter. I couldn't slow my research into the killer's background, his victims, his method of murder, all of it. I took a sip as I reread another police report. The killer had used a fire axe to commit the crimes. Very gory. That was good. Gory murders always sell better than boring firearm-related crimes. Even better was the fact that he'd killed families instead of single people. That was yet another angle I could exploit. I clicked on a news clip from the night he'd been arrested. The best part of this case was the fact that the lunatic had turned himself in. I drained the rest of my glass, already planning what I'd write about that. Family serial killer with a conscience? I made a list of names to contact the next day. The police raid on the killer's apartment had been highly publicized, so knew exactly where he lived. I looked up the landlord who owned the apartment complex and wrote his number down on a little notebook I carry around with me. A few well-placed lies might get me a tour of the killer's private quarters. I woke up the next morning with a splitting headache and nausea. But I didn't let that slow me down. I rolled over, took a shower, and went out to meet with the landlord of the apartment. He was a tall, portly man in his late 40s. He seemed friendly, and more than a little stupid. He unlocked the door for me and showed me a few of the rooms. The apartment had been almost completely cleared out by someone. I guessed first the police and then movers. I nodded along as the landlord continued the tour of the apartment, showing me the kitchen, then the master bedroom. I knew the killer had a habit of hiding bodies inside crawlspaces from my research, and was on the lookout for them. I noticed a vent in the corner of the master bedroom that looked to be pressure fit into the wall. Seems like a great place. Just the kind of thing I've been looking for, I said, wiping away the post-drinking sweats that were growing on my forehead. You mind if I use the bathroom before we finish here? The landlord pointed to the master bathroom. Be my guest. I purposefully spent a long time in there, hoping he'd leave the bedroom. I was rewarded when he called out, I'll be by my car downstairs when you're finished. I left the bathroom and crept up to the vent. I pulled hard on the metal, and was rewarded as it slid smoothly from the wall. Inside was a space about 2 feet wide and 1 foot tall. It extended back into the darkness for several feet at least. And there, lying in the dust on the metal floor, was a leather-bound notebook. I snatched it from the ground, hardly believing my luck. It was thick and well used, but I stuffed it inside my shirt for the time being. Replacing the metal grate was harder than pulling it off, but I managed it without making too much noise. I returned to the landlord outside, turning to look up at the small apartment. "I'm going to be honest with you," I said. "How's that?" he asked, confused. "I'm Jim Sullivan, a true crime novelist," I said. "I'm here to find out if there's anything interesting left about your most recently departed tenant." The landlord's face clouded over with anger. "So this was a waste of my time then? I was wondering if you had any information about." "Not for liars. Get off my property. I never want to see you here again." I thanked him and returned to my car, my mind already on nothing but the thick leather booklet inside my shirt. I rushed home, guarding the notebook like a goose with a golden egg. I prepared my desk with a spiral notebook and a blue pen ready by my right hand. Then, trembling, I opened the notebook. It was far better and far worse than I could have ever imagined. The killer had written his planning of the murders in excruciating detail. He explained how he watched the houses, how he waited to see whether or not the husbands loved their wives, whether or not the children were disobedient, what kind of dinners they ate and at what time. He must have stalked them for days beforehand. But the details in the planning were nothing to the details in describing the murders themselves. I had to pause halfway through reading one account. He kept describing the look on the father's face as his wife died. I poured myself a tall drink, drained it, then poured myself another. The killer languished in the description of their cries, their last dying moments, their pitiful supplication for mercy. I finished the bottle before I finished the notebook. After his account of the fourth family murder, the pages of the book finally, mercifully, went blank. When he finished describing the desecration of the last corpse, I closed the book with trembling fingers. My head throbbed with alcohol and the horrible images racing through my mind. But I couldn't help but hold my hands to my mouth in joy. What a find! What a treasure trove of information! 100 years of interviews couldn't give me what this one book had just dropped into my lap. I was going to be famous again. I laughed out loud to the empty room, picked up the already empty bottle of whiskey to my lips, and licked at the last drops before walking to my bedroom. I woke up late the next afternoon feeling woozy. I felt something worse than a hangover. Must have drunk more than I'd been planning to. But could anyone really blame me? Reading those horrible things I'd read? No, of course. No one could blame me. In fact, no one could blame me if I had another drink right now to ease this horrible throbbing in my skull. I got to my feet and walked to the kitchen. I cracked open a beer before walking back to my desk. The notebook caught my eyes as I passed. It was different somehow, thicker. I picked it up and realized that my blue pen had been lodged inside of the leather-bound notebook. I opened it up and saw a brand new entry that hadn't been there the night before. I sat down at the desk, trying to make sense of this new entry, written in a different handwriting from the others. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was reading. I read, in similar, meticulous detail, how I had gone to a house up in the mountains and killed a young couple on their honeymoon. I read about how I'd killed the husband, and that I'd taken the wife's body back with me. I immediately jumped to my feet and ran to my computer, Googling the address furiously. Had I written this in some kind of murder and alcohol-induced sleepwalking? The address was real. It was a house just a half-hour away, and there were no news articles about any murders in the area. My breathing continued to quicken as I stared at the house. The descriptions from the notebook matched it perfectly. It wasn't necessarily my handwriting, but there's no doubt it was different from the other entries. And it had been written with my pen. I Googled the nearest payphone, marked the location, and drove there. I dialed 911 with a gloved hand. 911. What's your emergency? A voice on the other end asked. Can you send someone over to a house for me? I'm concerned that something bad may have happened. Sir, what do you? I cut her off, instead passing the address. Did you get that? I asked. She said. I read the address again, then hung up. I drove back to my house, thinking hard the entire way. God, I needed a drink. My garage door opened up and I drove inside. It was only then that I noticed the axe on the ground. I closed the garage door and rounded my car. An unfamiliar axe lay on the ground beside the door to my house. I knelt down and picked it up to inspect it. The metal head was crusted with a layer of blood and hair. I stumbled back, holding my hand to my mouth, when no monster leapt from the darkness. I dropped the axe to the floor and walked inside to open another bottle. I spent the next hour constantly refreshing the news and praying for what must have been the first time in years. Please, I begged, please let this be some big misunderstanding. Please. It only took 3 hours before the double homicide was front-page news. I was already in an alcohol-fueled haze at that point. Every single detail was correct. Husband dead, wife missing. I realized then that I hadn't looked around my house. The wife's body was somewhere. After all, wouldn't she be in the house of her killer? The notebook had been silent on her final location. I spent the next hour looking through my house for places where I may have stashed her body, but came up short. A strange, bizarre revulsion to the notebook came over me. It had caused this. I wasn't sure how, but I knew that if I'd never picked it up I wouldn't have that axe in my garage nor a conscience so weighted down by, no. That wasn't possible. I had to get rid of it. I briefly considered burning the notebook, but rejected the idea. No, something told me that the book belonged back in the apartment where I found it. I drank a shot of espresso to sober up, then started walking. The apartment was just a few blocks away, and I figured I'd already killed enough people for one day. The night was cold, but I barely felt the chill through the haze of guilt, confusion, and fear. I reached the killer's apartment 20 minutes later. One of the windows on the ground floor was unlocked, which allowed me to slide inside. I closed it behind me and looked around at the apartment. The other killer had turned himself in, hadn't he? He'd had a conscience. My mouth turned down into a snarl. It wasn't my fault, even if I did do it. It was this damned notebook. I pulled it out and threw it onto the ground. After a moment of hesitation, I scooped it back up and walked up the dark stairs to the master bedroom. It was the same as I'd left it the day before, though the vent looked off. Maybe the landlord had noticed I'd messed with it. No matter. I knelt down and pulled hard on the vent, earning a cut on my thumb as the metal slid free. I reached down and grabbed the notebook, then extended my arm into the darkness where I hit something soft and wet. I flipped on my phone's light and saw the body of a woman lying inside, covered in enough blood to leave the scent of iron in the air. I stumbled back, trying to make sense of it. Surely I hadn't killed this woman, then driven to this house, right? Then my thought from earlier returned to me. The woman's body was almost certainly on the killer's property. The front door of the apartment below me opened with a crash. I spun and backed up, still on my hands and knees, as the sound of slow, steady footsteps climbed up the stairs. The bedroom door opened, and the light flicked on. The landlord I'd met the other day stood in the doorway holding an axe covered in still wet blood. "Well, I'm sad to say you weren't at home this time," he said, gripping the head of the axe with a beefy fist. "You're probably wondering what the hell's going on. Am I right?" He pointed the handle of the axe towards me. Am I right?" I nodded slowly, my mind racing. He hefted the axe in his hands. "There's just something about convincing other people that they're killers. Not even the light leaving someone's eyes gives me the rush I felt when that poor sap turned himself in. Sorry, liar. You just happened to be the next to pick up the book. But you made it easy. You even gave me your name. Looks like I'll have to leave that notebook out for someone else to find. Maybe a detective will wake up to find he's killed his wife. What do you think?" He took a step into the room. I jumped to my feet and ran for the bathroom. I knew from my time there earlier that it had a window. I'd only made it a few feet before the axe slammed into the back of my left arm. I ignored the pain and leapt at the window, crossed my arms into an X and crashed through the glass. The fall was just long enough for me to reflect on my poor decisions before I hit the ground. A dozen things inside me broke with the impact. But that wasn't what worried me. What worried me was that I'd hear heavy footsteps again. But I didn't hear footsteps. I heard a cry of surprise. A young couple ran over to me. "Are you okay?" the man shouted. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was the wife calling the police. I'll skip over my stay in the hospital, the police's fruitless search for the landlord, and my panic attacks. They still haven't found him. And I don't think I'll be able to sleep until they do. I let the police take copies of the notebook. But I still own the original. The Forgotten Murder at West Covina High. Many people have forgotten, or simply have never even heard about what happened at West Covina High School back in 2012, which is rather sad. Considering the victim always said that he wanted to be remembered forever. After he died, his name was Jeff Varisco. He was a star baseball and football player at the school, which by default made him automatically very popular. He was tall, dark-skinned, wavy black hair, beautiful amber eyes, a Hollywood smile, and had a body as if he was carved of stone. Every girl wanted him, including me for a while. He never seemed to like me more than a friend, though. Even though I was the head cheerleader and had no problem getting dates with other guys. Surprisingly, he wasn't even vain, which made him even more likable. He was always nice to everyone, even the really nerdy and loner type students. He also came from a rich family, and they always donated a lot of money to charity and cancer centers. His dad was a university professor and his mom was an executive for some company. Jeff was literally the coolest boy next door. One thing that many people did find a little strange, however, is that he seemed to be obsessed with being remembered and missed by everyone he knew and loved. When he died, he always brought it up to pretty much everyone he spoke to a few times a day. Nobody really thought much of it though. But you can only imagine the shock and horror when word got out that Jeff was found with the back of his head bashed in, stomach cut wide open, hanging by his neck with his own instances like a noose from the goal post at the school football field. Everyone was in complete shock and hysteria after it happened. Foul play was immediately suspected, and police interviewed everyone that knew him, from his parents all the way down to the school custodian, who was the prime suspect for a good while. But the police were at a complete loss. They concluded that the killer wore gloves as there were no fingerprints detected anywhere at the scene. Nothing ever came from the investigation. The only real evidence they found was a bloody ladder in the school garden shed where the custodian kept some tools, which is why he was a prime suspect. His parents always had accusations and pointed fingers thrown in their faces. By many people in the neighborhood, they eventually moved away, unable to bear it anymore. So many rumors spread around that his parents killed their only son for the thrill of it, that they knew they could get away with it because they were rich and perfect, and tried to put the blame on a school employee. All those rumors, of course, were ludicrous beliefs. The Variscos loved Jeff. I loved Jeff. That's why I did my best to make sure he would always be remembered like he wanted to be. I had to show him that I loved him even though he didn't love me the same way. That's why I called him at 1 a.m. on a rather cold morning, awakening him from his sleep. I had my gloves on, that I received from my dad from the previous Christmas, and asked him to meet me by an empty park to help me with my broken down car. He was always willing to help anyone who asked. He thrived on it. That's why I hit him in the back of the head with a crowbar while he was examining my engine. That's why I used all my strength to lift his unconscious body into my trunk. That's why I drove as fast as I could, passing through a few stop signs and red lights along the way, thankfully without being pulled over by cops. To get to our school football field where he once played. Before he regained consciousness, I had to drag his deadweight body from the parking lot all the way to the goalpost. I had to take numerous breaks to catch my breath during this part. That's why I promised him that he would be remembered as I pulled out my knife and gutted him as fast as possible. It would have been easier if that didn't cause him wake up. I thought for sure his scream would have alerted someone to come investigate what was happening, or worse, call the police. That would have ruined my way of showing Jeff how much I loved him. Thankfully it didn't, as his scream quickly became lighter until he fell silent and was only able to look up at me, barely managing to breathe due to the massive blood loss. He stared up at me with a look of hurt and betrayal in his eyes. I was pretty confused by this, and I knew I had the obligation to explain to him why I did this. You will always be remembered, Jeff, just like you always wanted. His eyes suddenly had a spark to them for a moment after he heard those words. He then managed to open his mouth to speak to me. Thanks, he responded in a weak whisper, before succumbing to his death. My eyes filled with tears of sadness and joy at the same time. I was sad that the love of my life was gone forever, but joyful that it was me who was the one who fulfilled his wish. I had to finish the job. I had to make sure people always remembered Jeff Varisco. I quickly made my way to the custodian shed by the school garden and picked the lock to retrieve a ladder. I rushed back to Jeff's body with the ladder gripped under my right armpit. Once I got back to Jeff's dead body, I set up the ladder to be able to reach the goal post. I once again had to pull his body up the ladder to the post, which was very challenging. It took me 4 tries to successfully do it. Once I finally managed to get his body to the top of the ladder, I pulled his intestines from his stomach, wrapped some of it around his neck, and then used the rest to tie around the goalpost. It was pretty hard keeping his limp body from falling over. I then climbed down the ladder and pulled it away from Jeff's feet so his body would dangle there from the post. My work was done. No one would ever forget him. But people have indeed forgotten. They all moved on with their lives. No one has spoken about the mysterious murder in years. I failed Jeff. He would be so disappointed in me. I needed to find a way to get people to remember the amazing Jeff Varisco, which is why I am posting my confession here. Please remember him. Please tell people about Jeff Varisco, the attractive high school kid whose promising future was cut short and was met with a grisly end. He never wanted to be forgotten. I searched my parents' names on the dark web. The videos I found were horrifying. When my friend first introduced me to the dark web, I was amazed at how such an unknown thing could house some of the most illegal things on earth. Up until today, I had only used it for learning how to code and commit small crimes. But after the horrifying videos I just found, I don't think I'll ever use the dark web again. I first met my best friend Alex when a little bit after I got into high school. My parents had moved us to a new town and I had no friends. It was lonely at first, but I got used to it. We moved because they were paranoid after many murders occurred in our town. I thought this was weird, moving across the country over that, but I let it go. The reason Alex and I became friends so quickly was because we both had a shared interest in the internet and everything it had to offer. I was a gaming addict and a Tier 3 Pokemon subscriber, while he was more of a coder and developer. 2 years later we were still best friends. But now, we were much older and smarter. Alex had discovered the dark web and he was obsessed with it. He pretty much spent every hour of the day on it, searching through anything you could imagine. There was nothing wrong with this, but one search he made was the biggest mistake of his entire life. I remember waking up to dozens of text messages from him one morning. This wasn't normal. Alex wasn't a very social person, and it was very hard to get words out of him. I opened my phone to see what he had messaged me. "Dude Jack, you have to come over right now. This is important. Jack, please wake up. This is urgent. Where are you?" These were only some of the messages, but the rest were very similar, with them all being urgent, and that I needed to go to his house immediately. My parents were both at work still, so I went over to Alex's house. When I arrived, there were 4 cop cars parked in front of his house, and there were dozens of people and news vans standing out front. I made my way through the crowd and Alex's mother told the police to let me inside. I could see tears rolling down her cheeks as she opened the door. "What's going on, Mrs. Gonzalez?" I asked. "Alex missing," she said as she started crying. My heart sank. How could this happen? He had just texted me earlier that morning. That was when it hit me. What if he was trying to warn me? What if his text messages were related to his disappearance? Still in shock, I walked up to one of the detectives in the kitchen. "Is Alex going to be okay?" I asked. "Of course he is. He's going to be just fine. We're going to find him very soon," one of the detectives responded. Something about that response was off. It was like I knew he was wrong. Deep down, I had this slight feeling that I wasn't going to see him ever again. I remembered the text messages, however, and pulled out my phone to show it to the detective. He texted me this morning. "What if this has something to do with him going missing?" I said swiftly. As he began reading them, his expression quickly changed. It was like it got worse. He told me they needed to keep my phone for now to investigate the text messages, and said they would give it back to me later. I stayed around the house for a while, not just because I missed Alex, but because I wanted to comfort his parents. They cared about me a lot, and it hurt to see them like that. His mother couldn't stop crying. Eventually, however, I went into Alex's room to see if I could find anything that might give a clue about why he went missing. I searched through everything, but I found nothing. But then I noticed something. Alex's computer was on, but his monitor was turned off. I looked for the button to turn it on and hit it. As the screen lit up, my heart sank. He was on the dark web. Obviously, this was normal, but for some reason, he had dozens of different tabs opened. I knew this part wasn't normal, so I closed the door and locked it, and began going through them. At first, it was all pretty usual for him, but then things started to get weird. He had a tab open that was an article about a murder that had happened several years ago. The article said that it was a woman who was found dead in her apartment. Her body was mutilated, cut up, and covered in acid. I nearly threw up reading it and seeing the horrifying pictures of the crime scene. Not wanting to see any of it anymore, I switched the tab, just to reveal another article about another murder. Confused, I quickly went through the rest of the tabs he had open. And they were all the same thing. They all were about some type of murder or crime. The one that stuck out the most to me, however, was one about a murder that had happened 2 years ago. At first it seemed pretty normal, but as I read further, I realized what it was. It was about the murder of our neighbor that prompted us to move away. Confusion quickly swept over me. How did Alex know about this? I never told him about it, because to me, it wasn't that important. I figured it must have just been a strange coincidence. But then I saw the last search he had made on his computer. It was my last name. Horrified and confused, I quickly stumbled out of his room and back to the living room. "Is everything all right?" Alex's mother said, sniffing away her tears. "Yeah, I just need to go home for dinner," I responded. On the way home, so many questions and thoughts filled my mind. Why was he searching up my last name? Did he think that I had something to do with this? That must have been why he was texting me so frantically that morning. If only I could just explain to him that I didn't do anything wrong. But I couldn't. He was still missing, and I had to find out why. When I got home, I raced to my room and slammed the bedroom door shut and got on my computer. I loaded up my Tor browser and turned my VPN on. I knew what I had to do. I began typing in the letters of my last name, becoming more nervous after every letter. When I finally hit enter, nothing happened. It was just a blank screen. Confused, I refreshed the page, but once again, there was nothing. But why did Alex search this if there was nothing? I thought to myself, there must be something out there. I was getting ready to close the tab, thinking I had ran into a dead end, when suddenly, the page started to load. It took several minutes, but finally, it loaded to reveal hundreds of videos. Immediately, I knew what they were. They were murders. But why did they show up when you searched my last name? I considered just stopping right there and turning back, knowing the horrifying things I would see if I continued on. But I couldn't. I knew this had to be why Alex went missing. So I clicked on the first video. As it started playing, I saw what looked like a woman strapped to a chair in some sort of basement or something. I quickly recognized who it was. It was our neighbor from 2 years ago. I could tell because she had the same heart-shaped tattoo on her neck. She sat there for a minute, struggling, panicking, and screaming for someone to help. However, suddenly, 2 figures walked into frame. At first, I couldn't tell who they were. But as they turned around to face the camera, my heart sank. It was my parents. My father was holding a knife, while my mother was holding a small scalpel. They paused for a moment before they started what was the most horrifying 5 minutes of my entire life. I watched as they cut her into pieces, and listened as she begged for mercy, screaming the whole time. Blood filled the room as she took her last breath. When the video ended, it quickly went to another, revealing the exact same room and chair I had seen before. I was traumatized by what I had already seen, and I knew I couldn't watch any more of it. My parents were murderers, and I now knew the real reason we moved away 2 years ago. I knew there was something off about that. But I just never could have imagined that this was the horrifying secret that they had been hiding from me. This whole time I thought Alex was trying to accuse me of being responsible for these murders. But I was so wrong. He was trying to warn me. I scanned through more of the videos, each in the exact same room. I was just about finished, ready to go to the police so that I could tell them about what I had just seen when I noticed something. There was a new video uploaded today on the website. I quickly clicked on it and pressed play to reveal what looked like a man this time. Strapped to the chair, he had a sack over his face, and I couldn't tell who it was. Once again, however, I saw my parents walk into the frame. My father walked up to the man and pulled the sack off his head. At first, I couldn't tell who it was. But then I realized who I was looking at. It was Alex. Story. My Unsolved Cases, Imaginary Friend. Hey, so I'm glad you all liked reading about my last case. It really helps me pass the time nowadays. Well, like I said, I'll stay in chronological order. So this next case came up about 1.5 years after the last one. At this point I've been on the force for about 5 years. So this case is unique for 2 reasons. This is the only case I will write about that has, legally, been solved. But I'm not so sure. And this was my first case that I could actually respond to in real time. Because it was called in to my local department. Anyways, I guess I'll just hop right into it. So I'm just drinking coffee passing the time. It was around 9:30 p.m. by this point. When we get this call, our department actually plays any local emergency calls they get over an intercom in the detectives department. They do this so that we can form an opinion in real time. It helps us out a lot when we arrive on the scene. Any detectives will know what I'm talking about. Anyways, I was the only detective on duty. There were 3 of us currently employed with the department. And this call came in over the speaker. It started off as most do. Some panicked person barely able to get out a coherent sentence. Then the operator asks the person to calm down so that she can better understand. It took this man about 2 minutes, longer than usual, to calm down enough to be able to speak audibly. Like I did on the last story. I'll just give you the transcript. But I'll skip to the part where you can actually understand what he's saying. Operator. Okay, sir. So again. Tell me your emergency. Victim. Name blurred out. Okay. Okay. I can do this. He breathes out heavily. Okay. So I was just making sure all of the doors in my house were locked before I went to bed. But when I got to my back door, I saw a shadowed silhouette of a man. I was in disbelief. I thought it was just a tree's shadow that I was looking at funny. But I went upstairs to take a look. Just to be sure. When I got upstairs, takes another deep breath. His voice was trembling this whole time. When I got upstairs, I looked down and had a better visual of what I was looking at. It was definitely a man. And he was staring straight at me. All I could see were his eyes. And he was looking straight at mine. Operator. Is he still there, sir? Victim. I don't know. I ran into the closet out of fear. Should I go check? Operator. No, sir. Stay where you are. I am sending a squad car now. Victim. Okay. I'm just going to take a quick peek outside. Operator. Sir, please stay where you are. Help is on their way. This is where I ran to one of the 2 squad cars that we departing the station to answer the call. Luckily, I didn't miss any dialogue because the man just agreed and stayed put in his closet. A couple more minutes passed. We were nearing the scene and the victim started talking again. Victim. I just heard something. I think he's on my porch. I'm going to check. Operator. Sir, please stay where you are. Victim. He's still here. Leave. He screamed this in desperation from his window. The man was really beginning to lose his mind during all of this. Operator. Sir, get back in the closet. Victim. Okay. I'm back. He was still in the same spot. He hasn't even moved. Why hasn't he moved? This is when we arrived. The only reason I was allowed to answer this call is because the department recently allowed it after we pressed our chief because of the value of real-time evidence. We walked upstairs and found the man trembling in his closet, clutching his cell phone for dear life. He began screaming, "Did you find him? Did you find him?" We had 1 cop searching the perimeter, and he radioed in saying he found nothing. We asked this man to show us where he had seen the intruder. He hesitantly took us out to the backyard where we proceeded to find nothing. This was typical of an intruder call. We could never find the criminal on the initial call. But this was different. It was different because the man who made the call started screaming bloody murder. He began yelling, "Do you not see him? He's looking right at me. Arrest him, please." We looked at him baffled and asked him what he was talking about. He responded louder than before, "Do you not see him? He's looking right at me. You're right next to him." This proceeded for another 5 minutes. And it eventually led to us taking him into the station to be evaluated. This was the first time I was able to witness a psychiatric evaluation. The interview was eerie. You could tell this man had been shaken to his core. The unusual thing about this guy was that, unlike every other mentally insane person brought in for questioning, this guy had no past to make us suspect he was insane. Like I said, this was my first time witnessing this with the force. so I didn't know the difference. Anyways, I'll just paraphrase how their conversation went. Psychiatrist. So tell me, name blurred. What exactly did you see? Victim. Well, sir, He takes a deep breath. I saw a man. He was just looking at me. His eyes were much bigger than a normal human's. Psychiatrist. Normal humans? Victim. Yes, unless he was wearing a mask or something. I don't think this man was human. He didn't have a nose or mouth. Just eyes. And they would come off of me. Psychiatrist. Okay, son. What else can you tell me? Victim. Well, when the police came to help, they walked all around this man. And the man didn't even acknowledge that they were there. He just kept eye contact with me. The interview continues like this for a little while longer, and after it was over, the psychiatrist came into the room where the two other detectives and I were sitting. The other detectives had been called in by this point. So, he tells us that, even after hearing what the victim said, he doesn't believe he is lying. He told us that this man genuinely believed what he told us was true. And judging by what he told us, the psychiatrist determined the man must have been psychotic. We talked to the man the next morning and told him that he was going to be sent to a psych ward for the next 2 months for rehabilitation. We sent him off, and I didn't hear, nor did I even think about the case for the next 2 months. I just wrote him off as crazy. 2 months pass. And we are told in our morning briefing that the man was released and was supposedly no longer mentally unstable. It didn't take the man more than 12 hours to call us. Literally that night he called in complaining about the same thing. I wasn't working during this time, but the detective who was filled me in. And from what I heard, it was basically the same thing that happened with me. The detective told me that they warned the man that if he made one more false call, then they were going to have to arrest him. I guess this scared the man off for a day. But just 3 nights after being released, he called again. Luckily, I was working during this call. While I was in the car heading towards the man's house, I was listening in on his call with our operator. I have since lost this call's transcript. But I do remember one thing about this call. In fact, I'll never forget it. This man had been calling from the same closet that he did when we first responded. And he had that same panicked voice, describing that same ominous figure. Only this time, instead of claiming the man was outside, he began yelling bloody murder. Just like in The Dancing Man case, when the victim yelled so loud that the phone call became muffled. The same thing happened here. The man was all calm in his closet, just waiting for the police to arrive. When he says something like, "Wait, what was that?" the operator pressed him to stay in the closet and he just ignored it. I heard him open his closet door and take what might have been 2 steps before silence fell over the call. The silence was broken when the operator started questioning the man and asking him what he was looking at. The man just responded ever so softly, He's right in front of me." Silence once again came over the call, and was once again broken by the operator. She was begging the man to respond to her. He never did, and we arrived on the scene 3 minutes later. We walked upstairs to his closet. As we were walking, I noticed that every access point, including the back door, was closed and locked. We got up to the scene and saw just the victim, dead after drowning in his own blood. His throat was cut, And after 3 days of investigating the crime scene, the department declared it a suicide. I pleaded with them not to close the case so quickly. But it was no use. It looks bad when a department reports an unsolved homicide. I doubt that this was a suicide for 2 reasons. 1. And probably the more obvious reason. A suicide weapon was never found. And 2. I got a good look at the victim. And his dead body, his throat was cut open all right. But not by a knife. The cut was rough. It looked almost forced. Almost like someone cut his neck with their fingernail. Anyways, that obviously isn't enough evidence to overturn a suicide ruling. But I knew, and I think the other detectives did too. The vibe in the office was just eerie for the next couple of days. The creepiest part was when we asked the psych ward that we sent him to for their evaluation reports on him. We read them, and every time the doctor would give him the same evaluation. He would talk about how the man acted immature, and was just acting under the stress of daily life. But at the end of every report, all 10 of them, he would put the same sentence. Seems completely stable. Just can't get over his imaginary friend. Corpse singer. I first met Jerry DuPont in 1986. I was a beat cop, and new to the force, while Jerry was a mortician, or rather the assistant to one. We didn't have much in common, apart from our love of stories, and our proximity to death. Despite that, we became friends, and often met at the Rose and Crown to have a drink after work, and regale one another with largely exaggerated stories. DuPont had grown up fairly well off. You could tell by the way he carried himself. He was stylish, always opting to dress up for the occasion rather than to dress down. And no matter how straight and rigid his posture was, Jerry always managed to look more at ease in a suit jacket and tie than I ever did in a t-shirt and jeans. One of the first stories Jerry DuPont ever told me at the Rose and Crown was the story of his life. And I was deeply interested in the family history he told me. His parents had died early, and all that was left was his trust fund, and a gold ring with an black onyx face that he wore on his left-hand pinky. It was the perfect detail to punctuate the tragedy of his youth. It wasn't until his teenage years when the narrative lines he'd laid before me began to cross over one another and I saw the nature of the game, and the rules he'd set between us. I was suddenly less than certain of the accuracy surrounding the death of his parents and the origin of the ring. But the light deceit wasn't off-putting. Instead, I found it freeing. Jerry and I were able to express ourselves to one another with far more candor. When the truth was tied in and around hyperbole, his willingness to sit and share his mind with me was a balm to the machismo of my day job. And I felt like sparking a friendship with him would be worth more to me than the overtime I was sacrificing by meeting him semi-frequently at the Rose and Crown. And so we began to meet more regularly. We spent those evenings talking, laughing, and drinking well past my bedtime. Unlike me, Jerry was naturally inclined to love the night, and would often invite the chance to extend our time together well past the closing of the pub. Sometimes we'd continue our discussion, or the continuation of a tall tale. But often we'd just revel in the company of one another. I soon began to notice that Jerry had an analytical, almost cold, and calculated mind. Sometimes, I would describe to him a case I had heard about or was working on, and presented it to him as if he were the detective to be, and not myself. Exercising that part of his brain thrilled him. You could see the pleasure it gave him plaster on his face. More often than not, he was able to spin the puzzle in such a way as to find the solution with an ease that was almost elegant in its nonchalance. When I asked him on one of our late-night walks after the pub had closed how he managed to deduce the solution with such eerie accuracy, he stated plainly, "You look for the why above all. You always have. How could you not? You arrive at the scene of the crime and are confronted with all angles and aspects of the case. You see the corpse as a human, someone who lived in the home they were killed in, comfortably and only hours before. I only listened then, and didn't speak a word." We continued to walk as DuPont left me without resolution to my question. He let me ponder his criticism quietly, before stopping suddenly beside a large maple tree, with our feet buried beneath the fallen leaves, and continuing, "I arrive at work, and put my vulcanized rubber apron on. I put my gloves on. I arrange my tools, my saws and scalpels. I turn on my tape recorder and begin to dissect. I see the plain truth of a person laid out before. I open the window of their soul with a sternal saw, and I peer inside. I can see all there is to someone. From above them, they can't lie to me, just like they can't lie to God." I was left wordless, as he seemed to ponder the truth of his own words, as if he had never asked the question of himself that I had. DuPont shrugged and sighed before quietly stating, "The corpses sing to me. The words would have been poetic had they not chilled me to the bone." He looked away from me, staring down the barely lit street, peering into the darkness. His eyes looked empty and lost in some near-forgotten memory. I saw him for the first time. The duality of DuPont, a person who could coldly put things together, and another who just as coldly took them apart. I grabbed him by the shoulder to shake him from wherever he'd drifted off to, and continued walking. It took a moment for him to follow, and the rest of the night drifted from one topic to another. Astronomy gave way to galaxies, gave way to the texture of the universe, and in there we found morality defined by evolving philosophy until weariness claimed and I said my goodnight to DuPont and caught a taxi home. By 1991, I had become a detective, with no help from DuPont, I might add, as I surely could have done so sooner had I relied on him more. But I wanted to achieve the rank on my own merits. DuPont had taught me much about the impartiality of deduction, and I was grateful for it, although sometimes I found myself envious of the inhuman ease his mind moved around murder. I only wonder now if it was because of Jerry DuPont or in spite of him that I became a detective. One morning in the early morning dews of October, DuPont came to me with a newspaper rolled tightly and tucked under his arm. He had a skip to his step as he met me uncharacteristically for coffee. As he sat, with no foreword, he pulled the newspaper between us and pointed his fingers to the headline. It read, "Vancouver, British Columbia, October 8, 1992. A cloud of fear and uncertainty has descended upon the residents of a rundown social housing apartment building called Rue du Chagrin in Vancouver, as a shocking and unsolved murder case continues to baffle both residents as well as local law enforcement. The incident, which occurred last week, has left investigators grasping for clues in the aftermath of a brutal and possibly premeditated crime. The victim, a 53-year-old divorcee named Anna Stillwater, was discovered in her unit on the 13th floor by a concerned neighbor who had not seen her for several days, and noticed a foul odor emanating from the apartment. The gruesome scene that awaited the neighbor was one of chaos, with the apartment tossed about, broken glass littering the floor, and chairs overturned. Ms. Stillwater lay on the floor in a pool of her own blood, with her throat slashed. More alarmingly, the assailant had made off with valuable jewelry, suggesting a possible motive of robbery turned deadly. What makes this case even more confusing for police has been the lack of any discernible entry point for the assailant. As stated anonymously by someone close to the case, the apartment's door was found locked from the inside, and investigators have yet to identify any signs of forced entry, leaving the possibility that the attacker was already inside when Anna Stillwater arrived home before the crime was committed. Despite the apparent lack of forensic evidence pointing to an intruder, the local police force remains resolute in their pursuit of the truth. Detective Sarah Reynolds, who is heading the investigation, stated, "We are exploring every avenue of investigation and are committed to bringing the perpetrator to justice. This case presents unique challenges, but we will leave no stone unturned." Intriguingly, the victim's landlord, John Miller, when asked to comment on the situation by local reporters, expressed his sympathy for the victim and their family, but also hinted at a possible motive. Miller stated that Ms. Stillwater had been consistently late with her rent payments and often had to seek loans, leading to some speculation that financial troubles may have played a role in the tragic events. Authorities are taking Miller's statement seriously, and it is now an integral part of the ongoing investigation. Detectives are delving into Ms. Stillwater's financial history and potential connections to determine if any debts or conflicts may have contributed to her untimely demise. As the investigation continues, the community remains on edge, struggling to comprehend the violent incident that occurred within the confines of their modest and tight-knit apartment building. Local residents have expressed shock and concern for their own safety, with many calling for increased security measures in the building. For now, the shadow of this unsolved murder hangs over the neighborhood, and the search for answers is ongoing. When I finished reading the newspaper's account of the event I already knew too well. DuPont said nothing. There was a tension between us. That was new to me. And as I looked at him, he stared back at me with that faraway, calculating inhuman look, his mind working busily in front of me, while his gaze peered through me to someplace far away. Finally he asked me what I thought, knowing, somehow, that I was assigned to the case. I told him I agreed with my superior, Detective Reynolds, that it was a complicated and unique case, unable to say much else. "You're wrong," he said flatly, his eyes snapping into focus. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't more than a little insulted by the tactless assertion he'd made plainly to my face." I rested back into my chair, my coffee sending swirls of steam between us, as I crossed my arms, trying as best I could to not get defensive as my ego withered inside me. All credit due to DuPont. He let me stew, and gave me ample opportunity to assert myself. But I didn't. As much pride as I took in my job as a detective, I knew that he had uncanny abilities that I simply wasn't born with. I gave him a terse nod. And he spoke. Ms. Stillwater slashed her own throat. He said, "And no more." I was as perplexed as I was disappointed. I had come to know DuPont as a person with a mind as sharp as a razor. And yet there we were, sitting before me, dashing all illusions I'd had of him until that moment. "No," I said. "The jewelry was missing and the apartment was ransacked. Not to mention the difficulty she would have had sawing through her own throat with a serrated steak knife." I thought to myself. Like a little boy, his eyes lit up. And I realized now I'd taken the bait. Already on edge, I didn't appreciate the frivolity and joy DuPont took in that moment. And felt the hair on my neck raise as I smelt the same psychosis in him that I saw in the many murders I'd investigated at that point in my career. Resting his elbows on the table and crossing his fingers, he began once more to outlay his theory in more detail. Ms. Stillwater frequently missed rent payments. This must have been frustrating for the landlord, Mr. Miller. So he gives her a final ultimatum: pay your rent or get out. She has few belongings, save for the jewelry she received as gifts from her husband before they separated. It's her safety net. In fear she's going to lose her place, she pawns them off to make rent, and pays Mr. Miller, but is just short of the total amount owing. So the landlord changes the locks without her knowing, but she returns home early and finds Mr. Miller outside her apartment. She's unaware he's just changed the locks. She only sees her apartment door open and Mr. Miller leaving her unit. Assuming he's come to serve her with an eviction notice, she rushes into her apartment and closes the door behind her, only noticing once she's on the inside and hears the lock click from the other side. That the second lock beneath the deadbolt has been changed. Mr. Miller, knowing she has adult children, tells her to call one of them to come and pay the remaining rent owed, and leaves her locked in her apartment. It was only then that DuPont paused for the first time, to catch his breath. Why didn't she just call the police? I asked. That's unlawful imprisonment. DuPont smiled at me, and I only resented him more in that moment. Despite our friendship, it felt as though he was gloating now as he continued to make his wild assertions. Ms. Stillwater refrained from calling the police because she was afraid that they would have her removed from the apartment. It isn't rational to think that would be the case in her circumstance. But also she feared she'd be homeless. Ms. Stillwater also refused to call her children because of pride. She's their mother and would never want them to take care of her. That's her job to take care of them. No. Instead, she stays in the apartment and wages a silent wage of attrition, knowing she has enough food to outlast the cruelty of Mr. Miller. The only problem is the building itself. It's derelict. The owners are slumlords. There's a CO2 leak in the apartment, and Ms. Stillwater begins to find herself short of breath. She's breathing, but the feeling of drowsiness overcomes her, and her heart rate increases. No matter how hard she tries to breathe in deeply, she feels as though she's suffocating. Ms. Stillwater rushes to the door, but it's locked. She's getting dizzy and crashes about her apartment. As she falls back on her instincts to survive, she thrashes about the apartment, tossing chairs and smashing the pictures on the walls. Finally, when she exhausted all options, she grabs a steak knife and begins trying to give herself a tracheotomy. It's the only thing she can think of. But she digs too deep and she loses balance as the apartment swims around her and her vision starts to go. She falls and her elbow crashes into the ground with the knife tip underneath her skin. The force drives the serrated knife through ligaments and tendons and is sent skittering across the floor away from where she lies bleeding out on the floor. It would have been impossible for him to know any of what he claimed to be certain. There were simply too many assertions being made. But at the same time I was unsettled to know that somehow my friend had been aware of case details we had kept under tight wraps and away from the press, such as the fact that a serrated knife had been used. Could my friend, Jerry DuPont, the sharpest mind I'd ever met, be the killer? I'd known him so long. And yet there was always the underlying lack of humanity. Could he be toying with me? I thought to myself at that moment, using our standing rapport to set our sights away from himself, and make her a victim of circumstance and cruelty? I countered then, trying to shake my mind free of the suspicion. Her fingerprints weren't on the knife. I said, feeling the tension loosen from my shoulders as his version of events crumbled before me. Then without a pause, he said, "The cat licked it clean." But there was no cat. The building was pet-free. And I felt a burst of laughter ripple through my chest at the absurdity of the claim. DuPont looked at me. I could tell he didn't take kindly to my reaction, and wasn't used to my dismissal. I'd never once in all our years questioned his deductive mind. He slammed his hands on the table, startling me as I fell quiet, before quickly placing them in his lap, ashamed at his own out-of-character burst of emotion. Mr. Miller came to check on Ms. Stillwater, unlocking the door and letting the scent of her bloated body out into the hallway, alerting her neighbors. And in the process let her cat, which she was not allowed to have, out of the apartment. I simply shook my head. It was too ridiculous. I offered my friend an olive branch, suggesting he needed more sleep, or that he was perhaps bored with his own work and had begun daydreaming, and that he should pick up a hobby not centered around death, I suggested. Once again, in a dismissive tone, I look back on with shame. Check the pawnshops in the area. Ask the neighbor. Check the keys in evidence they won't match the door. Talk to her friends and see for yourself that she had a cat," he said in a huff as he stood up, pushing his chair over in humiliation due to how I was treating him. I was stubborn in that moment, refusing to assuage his hurt feelings, remembering the tall tales we used to tell one another at the Rose and Crown. But as he walked away I couldn't help myself, and asked him how he could be so certain such a ridiculous story could be true. He turned, his face red, and said, "Her corpse sang for me." We didn't speak after that. I visited his work a time or two, thinking it best to smooth things over and apologize, but he refused to see me, having ordered his secretary to turn me away on sight regardless of the matter. And it wasn't until a year later, with little movement in the case, that I thought to bring DuPont's versions of events to Detective Reynolds. We were at our wits' end. The case was largely forgotten by the media, but we still worked diligently on it in our spare time. Until one morning, in a meeting, I offhandedly mentioned the conversation I'd had with DuPont as I was deep in the throes of nostalgia, thinking of my old friend as I often did when the Stillwater case came up. And while the version of events might have seemed too far-fetched to me when DuPont had laid it out before me, as I worked on the case up close, with the distance of time, no theory became too outlandish. Detective Reynolds was furious I'd not brought this detail to her sooner. But I explained just how insane it had seemed. Quickly, as if every minute counted. As if the gruesome scene were still fresh. And any minute wasted was an opportunity we might lose forever. Ordered an exhumation to have another autopsy performed. She called in a pair of beat cops and instructed them to canvass the apartment complex to determine if she had a cat. And took off towards the evidence room to determine if the keys we took into evidence from within the apartment matched the second deadbolt on the outside of the door. And as she walked away, Detective Reynolds called back to me and ordered me to bring Jerry DuPont in for questioning. I felt cold sweat seep from my skin. As I realized what I had done, I could see it in the change of her demeanor. Detective Reynolds could see the headlines already. Star Detective Solved Death of Stillwater. But the headline, Star Detective Catches Mastermind Murderer, was far more attractive in the eyes of the ambitious lead detective. And I knew that she meant to try it all together in some elaborate way as to benefit in a more grand newsworthy fashion. But what could I do? She was my superior and ordered me to bring in Jerry DuPont. It was early evening, and I parked outside the back of the funeral home where the adjoined morgue was attached by a covered outdoor walkway. And saw Jerry DuPont buttoned up in a dress shirt and tie. Beneath his rubber apron on the way back from the morgue, DuPont squinted in the light and was less than pleased to see me exit the vehicle. As he started walking briskly away, I called after him, ordering him to stop or I would charge him with impeding an investigation. That hurt him as much as it hurt me. I'm sick with myself thinking back on this moment. It was a bluff. But all men fear authority in one way or another, and despite his deductive intellect, he was too shocked to see through my deceit. The drive back to the station was quiet and uncomfortable. I tried to explain as best I could what it was that I had done. That time had shown me that his claim wasn't so preposterous and that I was sorry. But he simply turned his head away. And I was unsure if he heard me. Detective Reynolds conducted the interrogation. And I wondered at my desk how she would react to DuPont if he claimed the corpses sang to him in front of her. I didn't see him leave. But Detective Reynolds walked past my desk, rapping her knuckles on the surface, and told me I'd done a good job today. For a moment I felt pleased with myself. Until I concluded that the context of her compliment was that DuPont might have said something to implicate himself on record without requesting his lawyer be present. The next day, I went to see DuPont. Hoping to sit and talk with him, I wanted to apologize and help set things right. But once again I was turned away by the receptionist claiming he'd called into work sick. This did little to ease my mind. By that point Detective Reynolds was most likely already speaking with a judge to get an arrest warrant. Or at least that was my fear. Regardless of DuPont's wish that I not see or speak with him, I knew I needed to help my friend and make right the wrongs I'd unintentionally done. As I left the receptionist at the desk and got back into my car, I knew there wasn't a moment to waste. I drove round back, parking my vehicle out of sight of the front foyer of the funeral home, and got out. I pulled a set of lockpicking tools from my glove box and quietly ran to the morgue where I knew he'd be toiling away, and prepared myself for the stench of death and preservation chemicals that would bombard me the moment the door swung open. I looked about, realizing that was the first time I felt the anxiety of crime in my life. I felt the tools catch in the lock and make their way deeper, one small tooth at a time, until the lock clicked and opened. The room was dark save for a single light that hung over a stainless steel table in the middle of the room. DuPont wasn't there, but it was also the first time I'd ever stepped inside of the morgue. It felt odd to me that although DuPont had taught me so much about myself, I knew little save for that brief family history he'd once told me. I walked around and examined the blood and bile-encrusted drain at the foot of the steel table. The curiosity was simply too much, and although I knew this was an invasion of his privacy, I was not there as part of the police but as a friend, and so I excused myself. His tools, the saws, and pipes, and scalpels all sat on a table pushed against a wall. They were meticulously ordered and cleaned, gleaming under the harsh overhead light. I could feel the cold of the polished tile floor seep up through the bottom of my boots. And my breath hung in the refrigerated air. And that's when I heard a whisper. Small and faint, hardly louder than the hum of the fluorescent light. It sounded like a human voice spoken through the end of a balloon. Whiny and drawn out, escaping air instead of spoken words. I felt crawling terror wriggle its way up my spine. I could see I was alone, but where had the noise originated? Then again, the smallest whine, like a human voice, spoken through the end of a balloon, as if it was escaping a vacuum. The words were indiscernible. I looked low under tables and in the trash. I felt silly, as though I was playing a morbid game of hide and seek. But still I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. Finally I came to the wall where the tiny square refrigerator's doors stood closed in 2 neat rows of 8. I placed my ear to each one by one, praying that I heard nothing. And one by one, I came away having heard nothing but too afraid to open them, until I came to the final refrigerator door in the bottom right of the wall. I felt bile burn the back of my tongue and the insides of my teeth, leaving them raw and gritty as I heard the whine from inside. And a little squeal of fear escaped from my throat. I knew I needed to open the door and see what was inside. But fear kept me from doing just that. I'll admit I'm a coward, because in that moment I found I didn't naturally have the courage to face my fear. Even worse, my mind would not make heads or tails of what it was exactly that I was afraid to confront. I was shaking by then, and I'd love to say it was from the cold of the refrigerator room. But it was not. It was only with the brief invasive thought that DuPont might be trapped inside. That I found it within myself to grip the handle tight and yank it open. It opened soundlessly, and a gush of flesh-infused air gushed out at me. I could taste the body rotting slowly within, and had to stop myself from gagging. I could see bare feet facing me, and wanted to turn tail and run. But it was then I heard the whine again, the sound of escaping air, and without thinking too hard about what I was about to do, I grabbed hold of the end of the tray and yanked. The body came into the light and I gasped. It was Jerry DuPont, my friend, stark naked and dead. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My friend, who I'd spent many nights with talking and laughing, there in the corpse refrigerator, with both his pale rigged hands wrapped around a knife plunged into his heart, expertly slipped sideways between the ribs to the left of his sternum. I fell to my knees dumbfounded, and tears welled in my eyes. I felt the hot regret of our last 2 encounters, and wanted to bash myself in the face with my own curled fists until I was senseless. I hung my head low and cried. I couldn't hold back my emotions no matter how hard I tried. I felt responsible for his death, not truly understanding what I was doing when I put forth the theory he'd told me a year previous. Why had I not claimed it was my own absurd concoction? And then I heard it again. That small whine, long and drawn out. It was coming from DuPont's dead body. It was the gas bloating his belly, escaping from his lips. Is this what he'd meant when he said the corpses sing for him? Inconsolable in my grief, and out of my mind with guilt, I bent down, hoping to hear the soft words of my friend's voice one more time. I stayed like that, frozen in place for an indeterminate length of time, until the gas from his body broke free once more, escaping through his throat and past his lips. RRRREYYYYNOLLLLLDSSSSSS. I fell back, shocked and breathless. I knew I must be past my wits in shock. But I could have sworn I heard him speak a name. I know it seems odd and macabre, but I sat there a little while longer, hoping to hear the gas whine and run past his lips once more, resolved that what I heard was merely a trick of the mind. But his body now lay quiet and deflated. DuPont was simply dead. I walked slowly to my car and radioed the station, alerting them of DuPont's death. I chose not to wait for them to arrive and instead returned home in a daze. I called in sick to work the next day, unable to face the reality of the situation. I was grief-stricken, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. But I did turn on the TV to see Reynolds giving a press conference in regards to the Stillwater case. It played out much like I had suspected. But only Detective Reynolds held back no punches. With DuPont dead, she was free to make whatever claims fit the narrative, as he was no longer alive to refute them. He was the murderer, and he'd confessed to a friend on the force a year earlier, according to Reynolds. As she put it, the absurdity of the case made it impossible to solve with rational minds. And the culprit, Jerry DuPont, was as insane, sick and twisted as he was brilliant. At least he got that. Knowing the cops were closing in, he opted to take his own life in as dramatic a fashion as his elaborate murder of Ms. Stillwater had been, in order to escape justice and the consequences of his actions. I was disgusted listening to her on the television, and was glad for the 2 weeks paid vacation I received for my trauma. I don't think I could have stomached the lies when they were fresh. And I'm ashamed I tolerated them at all. I'm a coward. I feared losing my job. A job I'd worked hard for, and was proud of, but I let my friend's good name be tarnished. Upon returning to work, though, Reynolds called me into her office one last time, before she was promoted and transferred to a national position for the RCMP. I think she was congratulating me, or telling me to keep my mouth shut. I couldn't tell. My eyes were transfixed on a small gold ring with a black onyx face sitting innocently among the stacks of papers on her desk. Detective Reynolds was as capable as she was ambitious, and I needed no convincing to know what she had done. I saw a shrunken head in a museum, and I think I recognized it. I never knew my mother. I was only 8 months old when she died. Well, when she was murdered. I don't know much else about it. In fact, I didn't even know she was murdered until 2 years ago when I was 15. You see, My dad doesn't like to talk about her at all, and so he never discussed why she was no longer with us. I have seen photos of her, and so I know what she looks like. But I wasn't told much about her. I always thought that she died of a sickness or maybe in a freak accident. So I was very surprised when I found out that she had been murdered. I wish that my father would talk about it more though, because I want to know how it happened. I have heard a few rumors at school about how she died. I overheard one kid say that she was kidnapped and held for ransom before being killed when my dad didn't pay. Another kid told me that she was decapitated, and her head was never found. So I really didn't know what to believe, and I couldn't ask my dad to fill in the details. Ever since I found out about my mother's fate, however, I have become overly interested in true crime, and I especially enjoy learning about unsolved mysteries. That's how I found out about the strange museum that suddenly appeared in my town. My friend, Ellie, had first told me about it. "Have you seen that museum that opened in the old library?" she asked me one day at lunchtime. I replied that I hadn't seen it and that I didn't know anything about it. So she went on to explain what it was. I heard that it is a museum that is all about famous murder cases and has a lot of exhibits that feature real crime scene photos and even a few items that were taken from murder sites. She explained, "I'm going there on Saturday. Did you want to come?" I thought about it for a moment, but then remembered that I had planned to spend the day with Dad. So I had to tell her that I couldn't make it, which she seemed disappointed about. I thought about this museum for the rest of the school day, and I begun to wonder what crimes would have exhibits. Maybe they will have an exhibit for my mom. I thought, maybe I could find out more about her murder. I thought long and hard about whether or not I should try and go to the museum, and finally, I decided that I would go on Sunday. My dad was going out of town that day for work, so it was the perfect time to go. I spent the rest of the week leading up to Sunday both excited and nervous. I was excited because I knew that I would find the museum very interesting, but nervous because I didn't know exactly what to expect. When Sunday finally rolled around, I was more excited than nervous. My dad left early on Sunday morning, so I knew I had most of the day to explore the mysterious museum without him seeing me there. I got up at around 8:30 and got dressed and ready for my day. I then walked across town to where the library used to be. I soon arrived and saw that instead of the sign that used to read, "Town Library," there was now a sign that was freshly painted with the words, "The Murder Museum." There was already a couple of people in the line when I arrived, and so I stood behind them and waited my turn to enter the museum. In front of me was a large man that had a small tattoo of a bird on his cheek. He appeared to also be by himself, and it looked like he was quite excited to go in. He made it to the front of the line and bought a ticket and entered through the front door. It was now my turn. So I walked up to the little booth that had been set up and I approached the younger man sitting inside the booth. The man selling the tickets was around 25, and he had long black hair and a large smile that was filled with crooked, yellow teeth. "Ticket for one, please," I said to the young man and handed over a $10 note that I had gotten from my part-time job. The man took my money, without saying anything, and handed me a small, paper ticket that read, "Admit 1." He then pointed me to the direction of the front door and said, "Enter at your own risk." I walked over to the main door and pushed it open and stepped inside. Not knowing what to expect, What I found inside was mostly old newspaper articles of old murders and old, fading photos of what appeared to be crime scenes. They were all in glass displays, and the displays lined up in a row that led to another door. I looked through each newspaper article, searching for any mention of my mother. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything about her. Not even a mention of her name was present in any of the newspaper articles. I was disappointed, but I still found it fascinating reading about all of the true crimes that had been committed. I read about Kevin Fuller, the killer who would hide his victims' bodies inside his own private jet, and I read about Terry Sturt, the man who murdered both of his closest friends. I probably spent an hour or so walking down the long line of displays that featured the newspaper articles. I finally made it to the end of the row of newspaper cuttings and found myself standing in front of a small, black door. It was shut, but I had no other way to go but through it. I opened the door, which creaked as I opened it, and I stepped through into the next room. This room had a lot more interesting items. There were displays of old clothing, that, according to the small plaques underneath displays, were clothes that the victims were wearing when they were killed. There were also a few murder weapons that were in small glass cases. There were a few knives, a couple handguns, and even a machete, that apparently were used in various murders. I did find this interesting, but I found myself becoming a little bit overwhelmed. Thinking about all of the victims got me thinking about my own mother. I didn't spend too long in this room because I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. I moved through the large number of display cases, trying to avoid looking at what was contained inside, and I moved to another door. This was a bit larger than the previous one, and it was painted a dark red color. I opened the door and stepped into the next room, worried about what I might find. I walked in, and the first thing I noticed was the large glass case that stood in front of me. Inside was a small car, a Volkswagen Golf, I think it was. I quickly read that this car was used to lure victims and then they would be killed inside of the car. I felt chills run down my spine as I learned that people were killed inside of the car that I was currently looking at. I turned away from the car, and that's when I saw it. The shrunken head, sitting in a small glass case, across the other side of the room. I had heard of shrunken heads before, and I had seen a few photos of them, but I had never seen one in real life. I excitedly walked over to it and had a look at the small, shriveled head that was staring back at me. I looked at the head and had a sudden sense that I recognized the head. I looked closer, and even though the head was a lot smaller than usual and it was shriveled and it was hard to make out any facial features, I could still tell exactly who this used to be. It was Ellie, my friend from school, who told me about the museum. I knew that she had come here yesterday, and I hadn't spoken to her since. And I suddenly knew that something terrible had happened. I stood there frozen, for a minute, not knowing what to do. What had happened to Ellie? Yesterday, at this museum? Could the same thing happen to me? I didn't even want to think about it. All I knew was that I had to get out of here. I began to run back the way I came and tried to open the dark red-colored door that I had entered through. It was locked from this side. It was only open to people coming through. But you couldn't go back through it once you had already entered. All I could do was keep on going through the museum. No one else was around, and I hadn't seen anyone for quite a while. Which was strange, because there were definitely people lining up behind me. I knew that I had to continue. So I ran to the next door that was on the other side of the room. Past the shrunken head, I didn't look at it as I ran past. I made it to the next door. A small green door. I opened it and went through. I could see that this room was empty apart from rows of pots, all sitting on top of small, portable gas stoves. I cautiously approached the first pot and had a look inside. I just had to know what was in there, and once I knew, I really wish I hadn't. Inside the pot, looking back at me, was another head. That was boiling inside of the pot. I could already see that this head was slightly smaller than when I had last seen this. It was the small bird tattoo on the head's face that made me realize who I was looking at. I knew that this man entered before me, and somehow, his head was now getting boiled inside a pot, getting shrunk inside of a pot. Suddenly, there was a noise behind me, and I saw a masked man walk out of a door that was hidden in the corner of this room. He was heading straight towards me, and he was holding a machete. I knew that it was now my turn to become just a head. Just a shrunken head. I felt adrenaline racing through my body, and I began to sprint in the opposite direction of the man who was approaching me. I managed to run to the other end of the room, past the row of boiling pots. I saw that there was a small door on this side of the room. I managed to reach it, and I looked back and saw that the man with the machete was now gaining on me. He was not far from reaching me now. I turned the doorknob on the door and, luckily, it opened. I felt sunlight hit my face. I was now outside. I was out the back of the library. I kept running, trying to get back to the front of the library and then as far away as possible. I was still expecting the door I had come through to swing open and the masked man to run out. But it never did. I managed to navigate my way back to the front of the library. And once I was back to the front, I saw that there was no lineup of people waiting to enter. I probably wouldn't have stopped to warn them. Even if there was a lineup, I knew that I needed to get as far away from this place as possible, and so that's exactly what I did. I did go to the police about what I experienced, and they rushed down to the museum, just in case what I was saying was true. When the police arrived, the library was empty. Everything was gone. The newspaper cuttings, the weapons, the car, and the shrunken head. I do not know where they all went, but all I know is that they have left my town. Ellie is still classed as missing, and the police say that no one knows what happened to her. But I do. I know what happened. Murder on the Appalachian Trail. Murder on the Appalachian Trail. Holy shit, guys. I'm still trying to process this. And you'll have to forgive me if there are any typos in this because I am currently shaking like a leaf. I saw this site and felt like I would be able to vocalize to some capacity what happened over the past 2 days. But maybe I need to be calling the police? I don't know. I mean, I really don't. Okay. I'm an avid backpacker. I don't live too far away from the Appalachian Trail where it moves through the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'm always going up by myself. I've been doing that for years now, and never have I had a reason to think that I should bring someone else. But after this trip, I'm not sure if I will ever backpack again. I was able to get to my favorite spot just before sunset Monday night. Built a fire. Set up my tent and laid out my food. I was walking down to a spring to filter some water when I swore I heard a high-pitched scream. Typically, it's not uncommon to hear coyotes, bobcats, or other animals that make sounds similar to a human scream. So I just kinda thought that's what I was hearing. But it was still a little unnerving. Something was different about it. Filtering my water and then walking back, I saw a man coming from the east along the AT. We were eventually going to cross paths as I had to cross over the trail to head up to my camp. Slowing down his pace, it was obvious he had noticed me. For the most part, encountering other backpackers isn't a big deal. Everyone you meet is friendly, and if you find another solo packer, they welcome a little conversation. So when we did in fact meet up, I offered a smile and said, "Good evening." He said his name was Bradley and I told him mine. He looked like he had been on the trail for a long while. Black military-style cargo pants. Gray t-shirt. Black combat boots and a badass backpack that looked as if it was loaded with everything a person would need to survive in the wild. His hair a reddish-brown, shaggy and unkempt, which turned into a nearly full beard on his face. Super friendly, though, greeting me with a large grin. Bradley seemed like one of those guys that you instantly become buddies with. We chatted a bit about how long we had been on the trail and whatnot. As I suspected, he had hiked for nearly a month. Said he was taking a month off from life before heading back into reality again. He seemed so genuine. I have to admit I was taken by his charisma too, and I felt like we had been old pals for ages. Asking if he could camp with me, I felt no reason not to let him. Watching him unpack his tent and equipment, I realized how efficient he was. It almost seemed military in a way. Everything organized and neat as he laid out his belongings in a way that appeared mechanical. As if he had performed those motions hundreds of times. After he completed his setup, which really only took moments, he made himself some coffee over my fire and we chatted about typical things. As the night progressed, I noticed him becoming less talkative, staring into the fire or gazing up at the sky, all the while sipping his coffee. Eventually I decided to turn in and he said he would do the same. It was about 3 a.m. and I heard his tent unzip. It was a little cold and I remember specifically the sound of the laces on his boots being tightened. But after that I didn't hear him walking around. I assumed he had to relieve himself after all that coffee. But all I could hear was the night breeze sweeping over the highlands. Thinking about it now, I am literally feeling sick at my stomach. Fuck me. Okay, so I'm laying there nearly on the verge of sleep again when I hear far in the distance what I know for certain now was the sound of a man screaming. In absolute horror. The scream echoed throughout the forest in one solid cry and then it was silenced. In the moment though, in my near sleep state and with the sound of wind, I wasn't sure what it was. An animal or something. But I sat straight up in my sleeping bag and reached for my flashlight. Just silence though. Just the wind. The sound of trees and the feeling of every hair on my neck standing on end. Took some time, but I eventually went back to sleep. At the time I reasoned it had to be something else. That morning Bradley was already up and had his coffee brewing over a newly made fire. After waking myself up a bit and starting my own breakfast, I asked him if he had heard anything last night. He asked what I had heard and I described it to him as I did just now. He said something like, "Oh yeah, I did hear that. It was loud, wasn't it?" We talked about what sort of an animal could make a noise like that and neither of us could come up with anything. He even said, "To be honest, it sounded like a man screaming for his life." He asked if he could continue on with me, and at that moment I was glad to have someone with me for a while. Honest to God, he was such a nice guy, and I swear I never felt unsafe around him. Sometime during the day we passed a group of hikers. 3 women and 2 men, all carrying packs. They were heading in our direction but at a slower pace and asked us if we knew where a water source was. We both started at the same time to tell them. So I let Bradley finish. I've hiked this trail for as long as I could walk, and listening to his description of the trail ahead one would think that he had too. But I noticed early on Bradley had an impeccable memory and sense of direction. For the rest of the hike he asked a lot of questions about myself. By the time we reached a place to camp for the night, I felt like I had told him my entire life story. He seemed so honestly interested though. I felt like at the time that I was making a new best friend or something. That night was when I noticed for the first time the Bowie knife he had tucked on the side of his backpack. He pulled it out and expertly sliced an apple, nearly keeping everything but the seeds. I was kinda wondering where the apple came from, considering that last night he had told me that he was getting low on rations and that he intended to jump off the trail and hit a store before getting back on. But I didn't ask, as he tossed me part of it. He talked a little about his family. Specifically his younger brother, who he said I reminded him of. He mentioned more than once that I would have got along with him. He's not backpacked in years though. John was his name, he had said. After John had went away, Bradley didn't have a partner to hike with, and so he had been going at it solo for the past 4 years. I started to feel bad for the guy as I realized there was a part of him that was lonely, I think. I dunno. At this point I have no idea what to think. Shit. Okay. I have to focus. So that night I couldn't sleep. I was just wide awake, thinking about how my trip was nearly over and that I hated the feeling of coming back to work and dealing with the real world. I had to pee, so I put on my shirt, boots and tried to unzip my tent so as not to wake up Bradley. This was last night, and it was cold too. Standing in the woods I could hear just barely over the wind the sound of talking. Must be the group that we passed before. Most hikers like that don't ever think that there might be others around them. Or animals looking in, and so they talk and laugh as if they are the only ones in the world. I started to make my way toward the sound out of curiosity, I guess. I dunno what I was thinking. I could see their firelight jumping around between the pines, and one of the women burst out laughing. Before I got any closer, their voices dropped in volume. I was about 25 feet away with trees between us. The sound of that first scream still saturates my mind. Shit, I don't know what to do. I am going to have to stop typing for a moment. Okay, so it was nothing like anything I had ever felt or experienced before. Those people were dying. I know that now. I saw it on the news when I got home. I couldn't see anything, so I don't know what happened. I mean, I know what happened. I know it because of what the reports have said. But fuck, I don't really know. I don't. It was as if I were trapped inside of a tornado of screams and darkness. Somehow I was on the ground. Not sure if I fell down or what. Pine needles on my hands. I was trying to get back to my tent. That's all I wanted. I've never felt such fear. Yes, that's what it was. It was fear. It was complete terror. I could hear one of the men call out a name. A woman's name, but right now I can't think of what it was. I just know he sounded absolutely horrified. Then I heard him screaming. Begging and screaming. Crying and screaming. I ran. I was able to run finally. By the time I made it back to my camp and into my tent, the air was silent. Something had killed those people. But I knew it wasn't a something. It was a someone. I knew it and I know it. It felt like I was drunk. I couldn't think clearly. I was disoriented. I kept hearing things that maybe weren't anything at all. I sat in my tent frozen. That's what terror feels like. That's what it is. I am not sure how much time passed, but my heart stopped when I heard Bradley's tent unzip. I heard the sound of him taking off his boots, and then after his tent was zipped again. I could tell he was sliding into his sleeping bag. I didn't sleep. I sat there till the sun came up. That was this morning. We made a fire. Had our breakfast. He chatted a little about spring mornings and other things. I don't know how I held it together. I don't. He asked if I wouldn't mind dropping him off at a store near the trail exit I was about to hit where my car waited. Which I did. This morning about 11 a.m. we pulled up to Breaker's Market just off the @ He thanked me and asked if he could have my number in case he ever needed a partner for a hike. I gave it to him. After our conversations the days before, he already knows where I live and work. He shook my hand and patted me on the shoulder. I jumped in my car and got home this afternoon. I think I slept for about an hour maybe. The local news just reported people missing on the trail where I was. Also, I just heard that 5 people have been confirmed dead in what appears to be an animal attack. What do? I know why those people are missing. They're all dead. Most likely gutted and butchered, screaming to be allowed to live. God knows how many more are laying out there in parts right now. Their killer is still out there too. And I gave him my phone number.